The first time Corvin met Queen Virelia, he never imagined he'd be standing before her, given a wish that could change his fate. Earth had been part of the vast Xaverian dominion for nearly 50 years. The Xaverians, towering and elegant humanoid beings with silver-hued skin and bioluminescent patterns that flickered like constellations, ruled over countless planets. Though Earth retained some autonomy, humans were considered an inferior species, useful but unremarkable. Most humans resented their alien overlords, but Corvin was different. He had spent years studying them, working among them, and trying to understand their ways. As an ex-military engineer, he had been stationed in Xaverian territories as part of an exchange program. The Dominion rarely allowed humans deep into their technological research, but Corvin had proven his worth, navigating their systems and even improving some of their energy efficiency designs. His work had drawn the attention of high-ranking officials, and eventually the Queen herself. Queen Virelia was a being of impossible beauty and undeniable power. Standing at nearly 8 feet tall, her silver and violet eyes glowed with an intensity that made it impossible to meet her gaze for too long. Her bioluminescent patterns shimmered like a galaxy shifting across her skin, betraying emotions she rarely voiced. Clad in flowing garments woven from iridescent fibers, she carried an ethereal grace that left even her own people in awe. She was not just a ruler. She was a force of nature, an entity whose presence commanded instant loyalty and reverence. The Grand Festival of Zelvaris, an event that marked a rare planetary alignment, was one of the few times commoners and high-ranking officials alike could witness the Queen in a ceremonial setting. The festival was a tradition older than any human civilization, held once every 100 years. It was during this event that Corvin found himself standing within the Queen's Grand Hall, the air thick with shimmering lights from floating crystalline structures. Xaverian nobles surrounded him, their elongated forms draped in elaborate fabrics that shifted colors with their movements. He hadn't expected to be called forward. It had been a routine invitation, an honorary presence for his contributions. Yet, as Queen Virelia's voice rang out, melodic and commanding, his name was spoken among the crowd. "For your service, human, you shall receive a wish," she declared, her voice carrying across the grand chamber with an undeniable weight. "Anything within my power, you may claim." It was a test. He knew that much. The Xaverians were not in the habit of handing out favors without reason. Most recipients in the past had chosen wealth, titles, or the right to settle on an unclaimed world outside Dominion jurisdiction. The court expected him to ask for something mundane, something predictable. Instead, he took a step forward and spoke with unwavering resolve. "I choose you, your majesty." The hall fell into stunned silence. The murmurs were immediate, soft gasps, incredulous whispers among the nobles. A human had dared to request their queen? It was unheard of. Some scoffed, others sneered, but Virelia herself remained motionless, unreadable as she studied him. Then, after a long pause, her lips curved ever so slightly, amusement flashing in her gaze. "You amuse me, Corvin." She stepped closer, her towering form making him feel like a mere shadow before a sun. "Tell me, what makes you believe you are worthy of such a request?" Her voice was not mocking, nor was it harsh. There was something else in it. Curiosity, perhaps. He met her gaze, refusing to falter. "I don't believe worthiness is measured by bloodlines or power," he said. "You offered a wish, and I chose the only thing that truly mattered to me." Virelia's markings pulsed faintly. The gathered nobles waited with bated breath, expecting the Queen to dismiss him, to laugh at his audacity. But she did neither. "Very well," she said finally. "Let us see if you are worthy of your wish." A murmur of shock rippled through the assembly. Corvin's heart pounded, but he remained composed. He had gambled everything on a single moment, and the Queen had not turned him away. That alone meant something. She turned, her flowing garments gliding across the marble-like floor as she made her way toward the throne's elevated platform. With a flick of her fingers, a hollow symbol appeared in the air, intricate and glowing with ancient power. "The trials will decide if you are worthy," she declared, her voice carrying across the hall once more. "Succeed, and you shall have what you ask. Fail, and you will leave this place with nothing but a lesson in humility. It wasn't rejection. It was a challenge. Corvin had spent his life overcoming impossible odds, fighting in wars that had been written off as unwinnable, solving problems others abandoned. He had never backed down before. He wasn't about to start now. I accept. The Queen's smile widened, just a fraction. But it was enough for him to see what others might have missed. Beneath her regal composure, beneath the expectations placed upon her by an empire, something within her had stirred. And that was all he needed. The announcement of the trials spread through the Dominion like wildfire. No human had ever been granted such an opportunity. No human had ever dared to make such a request of their queen. Some considered it an insult, a mere curiosity soon to be forgotten once Corvin inevitably failed. Others watched with quiet intrigue, wondering if this audacious mortal could truly prove himself. Corvin wasn't a fool. He knew these trials weren't designed for him to succeed. They were meant to discourage him, to force him into submission, to remind him that he was nothing but a fleeting existence in the eyes of an immortal queen. But he wasn't about to let that stop him. If Varelia thought he would crumble like the others who had stood before her, she was in for a surprise. The first trial was the trial of mind. It took place in a grand chamber lined with towering spires of crystalline data constructs, each pulsing with light. A collection of the Dominion's finest strategists and tacticians had been assembled, their elongated forms draped in elegant ceremonial robes as they studied him with cold amusement. You are to engage in a game of war, one of them explained. A simulation of conquest, strategy, and adaptability. You will face 3 of us in succession. Should you falter, your challenge will be deemed unworthy. Corvin's lips twitched. He had played their war simulations before, back when he was first granted access to their archives. The Zavarians believed in control, in flawless strategy, in calculations that spanned centuries. But they underestimated humanity's ability to think outside the parameters of logic. The first opponent was a standard military commander, and Corvin dismantled his strategies within minutes. The second was a historian of war, relying on patterns of the past, predictable and methodical. Corvin broke that pattern by doing something illogical. He sacrificed entire fleets, creating an opening where none should have existed. The third opponent was a seasoned grand strategist, their mind a labyrinth of layered deceptions and contingencies. But Corvin had fought in real wars. He had survived where others hadn't. He didn't play for efficiency, he played to win. By the end of the final match, the Council of Strategists sat in stunned silence. The last opponent had no words. The crystalline projections faded, and the chamber's cool light cast deep shadows across their humbled expressions. You have passed, one of them finally admitted, though the bitterness in their voice was unmistakable. Corvin had barely caught his breath before he was escorted to the second trial. The trial of strength was held in a gravity-controlled arena, the floor shifting in unpredictable patterns beneath his feet. The Queen's elite warriors stood in perfect formation, their bodies adorned with ceremonial armor that pulsed with their natural bioluminescence. They weren't meant to fight him, they were merely spectators. The true challenge was the arena itself. The rules are simple, the lead warrior said. Endure until the final hourglass runs empty. It sounded simple. It wasn't. The gravity shifted at random intervals, pulling him in unnatural directions. At one moment, his body was so heavy he could barely stand. In the next, he was weightless, struggling to remain grounded. The temperature fluctuated, the air thinning, then thickening. His muscles burned. His lungs ached. He knew they were watching, waiting for him to collapse. But humans weren't the strongest species in the galaxy. They weren't the fastest. What they were was stubborn. Corvin grit his teeth, adjusted, adapted. He used the low gravity to conserve energy, then braced himself when it increased again. He focused on his breathing, steadying himself through the shifting environment. Minutes passed, then an hour. By the time the final grains of the hourglass fell, he collapsed to his knees, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. But he had lasted. There were murmurs among the gathered warriors. Some nodded in approval. Others looked away, unwilling to admit they had underestimated him. Acceptable, the lead warrior finally declared. Not praise, but not rejection either. Only one trial remained, the trial of will. Corvin hadn't known what to expect, but when he was led into a secluded chamber, he knew immediately that this would be the hardest challenge yet. The room was dimly lit, the walls lined with shifting patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. At the center of the chamber stood Queen Virelia herself. "You have done well," she said, her voice softer than before. "But endurance and strategy alone do not define worth. This final test will determine the strength of your spirit." He took a step forward, only to freeze as an unseen force wrapped around his mind. A sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced crashed into him. A rush of emotions, memories, fears that weren't his own. His past unfolded before him, raw and unfiltered. The battlefields he had fought on, the men and women he had lost, the choices that had weighed on his soul for years. He was reliving it all at once. The screams of the dying, the feeling of helplessness as he watched a comrade fall, unable to save them, the bitter taste of failure. It was overwhelming, suffocating. It would have been easy to give in, to let the pain consume him. But then, through the haze of agony, he saw her, Virelia, standing there watching him, waiting for him to break or to endure. He clenched his fists, grounding himself. He had survived worse. He had lived through hell and come out the other side. He wasn't going to crumble now. With a slow, deliberate motion, he stepped forward, breaking through the illusions, the memories. He reached out and took her hand. The force vanished. The chamber returned to silence. Virelia looked down at their joined hands, her markings flickering in a pattern he couldn't decipher. When she finally spoke, there was something different in her voice. "You pass." It was not just an acknowledgement of victory. It was something more. He saw it in her eyes. And he knew something had changed between them. The aftermath of the trials sent ripples through the Dominion. No human had ever challenged the authority of the Xaverian elite and won. No human had ever stood before Queen Virelia and proven themselves worthy in the eyes of their people. Yet Corvin had done just that. The reactions were mixed. Some Xaverians scoffed, unwilling to accept that a mortal had passed their sacred traditions. Others whispered in private circles, speaking of the human who had defied expectations. And some watched with growing fascination. But the only opinion that mattered to Corvin was Virelia's. She had not dismissed him. She had not laughed at his request. She had given him a chance, a real one. And as he stood before her now, in the solitude of the Queen's private chambers, he could feel the weight of that decision between them. The grand hall of the trials was behind them, the audience of nobles and warriors gone. Here, there were no watchful eyes, no murmuring spectators. Only the two of them. Virelia regarded him with quiet intensity. Gone was the formal regality of the throne room. Here, she was something else. Less a queen, more a woman weighing a decision she had never expected to face. "You intrigue me, Corvin." Her voice was softer than before, almost contemplative. "You could have asked for anything. Power, wealth, a home beyond the Dominion's reach. Yet you chose me." He met her gaze without hesitation. "Because none of those things matter to me." Her bioluminescent markings flickered, shifting through shades of violet and deep blue. "Do you even understand what you've asked for?" "I understand perfectly." He took a step closer, watching her closely. "You gave me a wish and I used it to be by your side. I don't regret it." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips, fleeting yet unmistakable. "You assume I would accept such a thing. Would you?" he asked, voice steady. Virelia studied him for a long moment, searching his face for doubt. There was none. "You are bold, Corvin." She lifted a hand, brushing her fingers lightly over his temple, tracing the faint scar above his brow. The touch was unexpected, almost reverent. Humans burn brightly, but they fade quickly. Your kind is fleeting, while mine endures for centuries. "Then let me burn brightly for you," he murmured. The words hung between them. He saw something shift in her expression. something unspoken, something she had perhaps long denied herself. A queen was meant to rule, to lead, to be an untouchable figure of authority. But she was still a woman beneath it all. "You tempt fate, human," she murmured, stepping closer, her presence a force of gravity all its own. "I'm not afraid of fate," Corvin answered. "I'm afraid of wasting what little time I have." For the first time since he had met her, she looked uncertain. Not in a way that suggested weakness, but in the way of someone standing on the edge of a precipice, contemplating a leap into the unknown. Then, without another word, she closed the distance. Her lips met his and the world fell away. There was no throne, no dominion, no expectations. Only the warmth of her touch, the way her bioluminescence flared at the contact, the way she pulled him closer as if trying to memorize the shape of him against her own. Corvin responded in kind, his hands finding her waist, his fingers tracing the intricate, glowing patterns along her skin. She was unlike anything he had ever known, powerful, breathtaking, and utterly real in this moment. When they finally parted, her gaze burned into his. "Your wish has been granted," she whispered. And for the first time in his life, Corvin knew he had made the right choice. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change, both for Corvin and for the Dominion itself. Whispers spread through the courts, through the noble houses, through the ranks of warriors who had once laughed at the idea of a human standing beside their queen. Some called it madness, some called it weakness, but there were also those who saw it for what it was, an undeniable shift in the way things had always been. Virelia did not address the murmurs directly. She did not explain herself, nor did she offer any justification. She was a queen, and her word was law. If she had chosen Corvin, then that choice was final. But he could see it in her eyes, the weight of it, the knowledge that her people would not accept change so easily. It didn't matter to him. He had never been a man who concerned himself with the approval of others. His life had been defined by war, by survival, by fighting for what mattered. And now what mattered was her. So when she came to him in the quiet hours of the evening, stepping into his chambers with a softness that did not befit a ruler, he welcomed her without hesitation. "You do not regret it," she murmured, studying him as if she could not quite understand why. "Never," he answered without pause. Virelia exhaled softly, shaking her head. "Even if they turn against us?" "Let them try," Corvin said. "I didn't fight through the trials just to back down now." Her lips curved, a small, rare smile that made his heart tighten. "You are reckless, and you like it." She did not deny it. Instead, she stepped closer, her bioluminescence casting a soft glow against his skin, as she lifted her fingers to trace the scar above his brow. A touch she had grown fond of in the days since their first kiss. "You will stay," she said, but it was not a command. It was a question. Corvin caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Always, but not everyone in the Dominion was willing to accept such a thing. The challenge did not come from the people, nor from the noble houses that watched from the shadows. It came from General Ozer, a warrior of legend, one who had served the Dominion for over 2 centuries. He had fought in wars that reshaped the stars, had stood by Virelia's side through battles that defined their empire. And now he stood against her, against them. "It is an insult," Ozer declared, his voice carrying through the grand hall where the council had gathered. "A human cannot stand as your equal. It is a weakness our enemies will exploit." Virelia sat upon her throne, her expression unreadable. "You speak as though I have been forced into this choice, Ozer." The general's bioluminescent markings pulsed with agitation. "I speak as a warrior who has sworn to protect you. I will not see the Dominion weakened by a fleeting attachment." Corvin had expected this. He had known there would be those who refused to accept what had happened. He had been prepared for whispers, for cold glares in the halls. But not this, a direct challenge, a test of his right to stand at her side. Virelia's gaze flickered to him, and in that moment, Corvin understood. This was not something she could stop. If she ruled with an iron decree, it would be seen as bending to emotion. If she denied the challenge, it would be seen as fear. There was only one way forward. So Corvin stepped forward himself. You want proof that I belong here? His voice was steady, unwavering. Then I'll give it to you. Ozer's gaze snapped to him, unreadable but sharp. You challenge me? You challenged her. Corvin met his eyes without flinching. I'm just answering it. A murmur swept through the council. Virelia remained silent, her gaze locked on him. Then, ever so slightly, she nodded. The challenge was set. The arena was the same one where Corvin had endured the trial of strength. But this was different. There was no shifting gravity, no environmental manipulation. This was a test of combat, pure and simple. Ozer was a seasoned warrior, taller than Corvin by nearly a foot, his movements precise, his strikes deadly. He wielded a Zavarian warblade, its energy humming with contained power. Corvin had only his own skills, his own experience. It would have to be enough. The first clash sent a jolt through his arms as he parried the blow, the force of it nearly knocking him off balance. Ozer did not hold back. He fought with the full intent of proving Corvin's unworthiness. But Corvin had never been the strongest fighter. He had never relied on brute strength. He fought to win. He moved fast, weaving between Ozer's strikes, using his size and speed to his advantage. The general was powerful, but he was used to fighting warriors like himself, opponents who met force with force. Corvin didn't. He dodged. He adapted. He found the openings, the small hesitations, the half-second pauses in Ozer's movements. And when the moment was right, he struck. The fight lasted longer than anyone expected. Long enough that the murmurs grew into stunned silence. And then, with one final, decisive move, Corvin disarmed him. Ozer's blade hit the ground. Corvin stood over him, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow. He didn't press the advantage. He didn't strike a final blow. He simply waited. And after a long moment, Ozer let out a slow breath. Then he knelt. A ripple of shock went through the onlookers, but Corvin barely heard it. Ozer bowed his head. You have proven your worth. It was not just acceptance. It was respect. And when Corvin turned, his gaze finding Virelia's in the crowd, he saw something else in her eyes. Pride. That night, when the halls were quiet and the weight of the day had settled over them both, Virelia came to him once more. She did not speak at first. She simply stepped into his space, her hands finding his, her markings glowing in soft, shifting hues. You could have walked away, she said eventually. You could have chosen an easier path. Corvin lifted a hand, brushing his fingers along her jaw, tilting her chin up until her gaze met his. But then I wouldn't have you. Virelia's breath hitched, just slightly. And then, with no more hesitation, she kissed him. This time it was not tentative. It was not a question. It was an answer to everything they had fought for, an answer to the world that would never be the same, an answer to the love that had begun with a wish and had turned into something far greater.